Happening today, a federal judge will decide whether or not President Trump's freeze on federal aid programs can resume. The White House says it only applies to programs impacted by executive orders, including those aimed at ending diversity, equity, and inclusion. But a group of Democratic state attorneys general sued to stop it, calling it unconstitutional. I want to now bring in trial attorney John Fishwick, who's a former U.S. attorney for the Western District of Virginia. John, it's always good to have you. So now you have two federal judges that have temporarily blocked this spending freeze. So how high a bar does the White House have now in defending this move?
Markie, I think we're headed for a showdown that may eventually make its way to the United States Supreme Court. The Trump team is saying, look, presidential spending powers are broad. The executive has tremendous power to decide where federal monies are spent for grant money and loan monies. And these two judges so far have said not so fast. These decisions are made by Congress. So we're really headed to kind of a separation of powers showdown. Does the president decide on the federal agency money, for example, that DEI money cannot be spent, that programs that are designed, for example, to protect folks that the Biden administration wanted to protect, that the Trump administration does not. So who has this power, the Congress or the president? And so I think we're headed for the United States Supreme Court, which has shown an inclination to have broad presidential powers. So that's where I think these two cases are headed, Markie.
Yeah, and break this down for me just in layman's terms. My team and I were talking about this morning because I'm always confused when random federal judges pop out of random states across the country. If two judges have, so far temporarily blocked this freeze, but then today's judge gives it the green light, I mean, that seems like 2 against 1 to me. So how does that move forward?
So I think both these cases will be fast-tracked. One's in Washington, D.C., one is in Rhode Island. Two federal judges so far have blocked the Trump initiative to pause the funding while they look to see which program should be stopped or not. So they'll then be, whoever wins or loses today will appeal to the Court of Appeals. I think either or both of these cases will be fast-tracked to the Supreme Court. Ultimately, the Supreme Court is going to have to decide how broad is the presidential power on spending decisions in this country. I think the Trump legal team wants to flex their muscles early in his administration so they can lay down markers that, in fact, they're in charge of many of these spending decisions. Ultimately, the Supreme Court is going to have to decide how far it goes. But I do not expect these decisions by these lower court judges to hold up. I think the Supreme Court is going to find that presidential spending power is broader than these two judges have said so far. And so I think in the weeks and ahead, we're going to see these decisions reverse. And ultimately, the United States Supreme Court is going to say presidential power is broad, just like they did last summer when they said presidential immunity on criminal cases is very broad.
Yeah. And where does that power, what does that look like now? Because the debate over how far a president can go in suspending funding passed by Congress, that also came up when President Biden paused some weapons shipments to Israel. So currently, as things stand now, how much authority does a sitting president have when it comes to funding decisions, John?
So, Markie, the older decisions give more of the power to Congress. The cases in the Nixon administration have given more of the power to Congress when it's come to these decisions on spending power. After all, Congress does appropriate the money. But more recent decisions, and I think this United States Supreme Court looks at the presidential power is much more expansive, that the president gets to decide how money is spent, which priorities are focused on. After all, the president just won an election where he talked about many of these issues. And so Trump says, look, I told folks I was going to eliminate DEI. I'm allowed to pause those programs and to eliminate those programs. And so I think this case and these cases will be fast-tracked to the Supreme Court. Ultimately, we're going to see showdowns over how broad and expansive is presidential spending power in this country.
Yeah, we'll see how today shakes out and where things go from here. John Fishwick, always a pleasure to have you, sir. Thanks.
Thanks for watching, everybody. Go to joinnn.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. Also, don't forget to click that red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.